Here's where we are in the governance series. We completed phase 1, seeing the system, letters 1 to 12. We are in phase 2, designing the system, letters 13 to 30. We completed stage 1 through stage 5. We are in stage 6, governance redefined, letters 27 to 30. We just completed letter 27B, activity is not accomplishment. We are in letter 27C, which backup would you restore? In letter 27B, we introduced the scenario for our workshop and took note of what attracted our attention. We allowed that to be the starting point of our observation, the point from which we would intentionally explore other perspectives and discover what becomes visible that we may not have seen from that initial observation. We will follow that format here. Recall that organizations open doors familiar to them. That door could be a request for training, a network outage, an operational assessment, or a stalled project. That door reveals the perspective from which the organization can currently see. One objective is to discover what is occurring behind that door. This workshop returns us to an environment we encountered in letter 26B, the cybersecurity scenario of ransomware. I was part of a global team asked to develop and deliver workshops for the customers of a technology company that had developed an end-to-end enterprise security solution, not to teach individual security products, but expand how organizations thought about security. Cybersecurity offers an opportunity to examine an organizational reality that can be difficult to see from inside any single area of responsibility. Cybersecurity requires the collaboration of individuals and teams working in multiple technologies, like the network, security, storage, and application. Our focus is on what may be occurring across the organization that no one can visibly see. Because cybersecurity requires us to look beyond any single technology we mentioned earlier, building a defensive against cybersecurity attacks requires specialization, because these technologies have become too intensive for most people to maintain expert-level depth across all of them. The question is not whether everyone should know everything, but what becomes visible when people who do understand different parts of the environment begin looking at how those parts work together. As a result, I begin every workshop presenting some historical context in order to understand how we arrived at the environment we have today. What technologies were introduced along the way, and what problems were they intended to address? Were dependencies created, and the impact when one of them changes? The history was not there simply to teach history. It gave participants a way to see relationships that were difficult to see when looking only from inside their own specialization. That became particularly important when we began discussing ransomware. A threat actor does not enter an organization and follow its organizational chart. Is it important for a threat actor to know which executive networking or storage or security reports to? Maybe, maybe not. The attacker experiences a connected environment. An entry point in one area can provide access to credentials for a device somewhere else. That compromised device exposes additional systems, granting unrestricted, boundless communication through the network, providing information to discover the location of other devices. The attacker can continue learning about the environment long before the ransomware launch becomes visible to the organization. Now place yourself in that environment. You are not the security, the network, or the storage engineer. You are the executive responsible for exercising judgment about the organization these specialists collectively support. Based on what you have heard so far, what attracted your attention? Make a note of what you think you would need to understand. I invite you to add another dimension to this. During the workshop, I would spend time distinguishing among 3 network designs that contribute to organizational resilience. Selecting which network design or capability is appropriate can be determined by establishing what is at stake. Consider 2 organizations. One organization loses $1 million every day a critical system is unavailable. Another loses $1 million every minute. Would you expect those organizations to make the same technology decisions? Perhaps, perhaps not. Now add another requirement. Suppose information must not merely be available, but must be accurate and available when it is needed. Does that change anything you were considering? Consider these three network designs: fault tolerance, availability, and backup and recovery. Availability maintains a system online and reachable as much as possible and allows brief moments of downtime while a backup system becomes operational. Fault tolerance maintains operational capability with zero downtime, even if a part breaks, by incorporating instant duplicates of hardware and software, redundancy. Users see no interruption in service. Backup and recovery protect data against permanent loss, corruption, or disasters by creating static copies of data and stores them in a safe secondary location. This requires recovery time to put the data back into an operational state. In addition, storage RAID architectures deliver different combinations of performance, redundancy, capacity, and protection. Understanding the technological differences in considerable detail cannot determine which design is appropriate. Someone has to connect the technical decision to what is at stake for the organization and the business drivers. Where does that understanding reside in your organization? Who understands both the business consequence and the technical capability? Who can see the relationship between them? Think about your own organization. Let us utilize the executive navigation chart to orient ourselves and track the changes in our perspectives and observations as we have gathered information. Experience. The first phase states, an event allows the organization to reveal something that previously remained unnoticed. What attracted your attention as we shared the information regarding the mechanics involved in protecting your organization, as well as the activities performed by a threat actor? Did your perspective or observation or decision criteria change as we moved through the ransomware scenario? Where did you first point the telescope? Was there a moment when what you believed you were seeing changed? Now let us move to something almost every executive has heard during a cybersecurity or resilience discussion. We have backups. What are you thinking when you hear that sentence? What is the significance of having backups? In the ransomware workshop, we go considerably deeper than saying backup and restoration are important. Consider what can happen before the ransomware event becomes visible. In letter 26B, we introduced the Lockheed Martin cyber kill chain, which describes how a threat actor has multiple opportunities to penetrate, establish persistence, move laterally, and ultimately accomplish their objective. The term exploit kit denotes the code that is packaged so it can be introduced into your company environment and remain dormant until the threat actor decides to launch the code. The code may have several stages. One stage is to announce itself. Another stage is used to explore the environment, where devices can be discovered, connections can be made, information can be gathered, and passwords can be discovered and later changed. Documents that were discovered can be encrypted when the ransomware attack is announced, rendering those documents inaccessible. During the time the exploit kit code is inside the environment, the organization continues operating, including performing its normal backups, creating a false impression that everything is secure. As the backups are done, weeks or months pass. Then the ransomware announcement occurs on the employee computer screens. I do not say the ransomware attack occurred because it gives you the impression that is the day the exploit kit code entered your organization. We are all now aware the exploit kit code could have been in your network for a year and only announced today. Are you with me so far? What happens on announcement day? Systems become unavailable. Operations are disrupted. Many times, technical support cannot even gather information because, remember we said earlier, the passwords have been changed and the documents have been encrypted. The organization needs to recover, and someone says, restore the backup. In the executive navigation chart, this is calibration. Something is different than what I believed. Based on everything that we have just said, see yourself sitting at the executive table. What are you thinking now? Remember, we just made it clear the day the ransomware attack became visible is not necessarily when the environment was first compromised. So, when someone says, we have backups, what does that actually tell us? I'm not asking you to determine whether the backup is good or bad. I'm asking you to notice whether the meaning of we have backups has changed in your mind due to the additional information, other perspectives that have been brought to your attention. This is us directing the telescope to observe different parts of the situation. We move to recognition phase. The executive begins understanding what the experience is actually revealing. This was one reason I spent considerable time walking participants through the different parts of the kill chain. A superficial description can make ransomware appear to be a single event. An attacker gets in, ransomware executes, backups are restored, systems are operational again. As you begin your investigation and research to equip you with information to proceed, you will notice how different specialists within their respective areas may understand different portions of what is occurring. Each specialist may be correct about what they see. Imagine you're receiving information from all of them. Do all of these accurate views automatically give you an understanding of the organization as a whole? Those questions help us enter the calibration part of recognition, which states we need a way to interpret what we have just experienced. Which backup would you restore? Even though the security team may know when backups were performed and when malicious activity was detected, let us add one more piece of information before we leave recognition. We have been discussing what an exploit kit might observe while it remains inside the environment. What if it was not only observing, but making changes to company data during that period? How would you know? If data was changed, what else might have been affected that is not immediately visible? Consider the reports that were produced from that data. The dashboards executives may have been using to make decisions. What information was leadership relying upon during the period between the initial compromise and the ransomware announcement? Who was validating and verifying the integrity of the data? And perhaps even before answering that question, who knew that the integrity of the data needed to be questioned? Notice what has happened again. We pointed the telescope in another direction. Earlier, we were concerned about whether the organization could restore its data. Now, other possibilities have become visible. What exactly are we restoring? And beyond restoration, what information has the organization been using to operate and make decisions while the compromise remained unknown? Has this additional perspective changed what you believe the experience is revealing? We have enough information to proceed to the next phase of the executive navigation chart. Name. Return to letter 13A and identify the structural pattern that best explains the experience. Look for the structural pattern that gives you the most useful language for describing what this experience is beginning to reveal. Throughout the workshop, we repeatedly asked the executive to consider what is at stake. We could also say, what is at risk? Ransomware itself is not risk, but one possible event through which risk becomes visible. Risk is not determined merely by looking at whether a technology or control exists, but to understand what technology the organization depends upon and to know what happens when that capability is unavailable, compromised, inaccurate, or no longer trustworthy. That is where risk begins to acquire meaning. Initially, we might have thought the risk was the exploit kit that caused our systems to become encrypted and unavailable. But then we considered what could happen if the company data was changed. Now the risk is no longer simply whether the organization can restore operations, but the exposure of making decisions from reports and dashboards generated from information whose integrity they did not know had been compromised. The potential consequences extend from technology into operations, financial information, customers, executive decisions, and anywhere else that information was used. Now consider the organization can still lack visibility even though every technology department can possess information. The organization can be blind. This is why the kill chain was important. The threat actor does not experience organizational boundaries, but an interconnected environment. The attacker can enter through one part of the environment, communicate through another, discover devices somewhere else, compromise credentials, move through the network, locate information, and eventually affect systems owned by entirely different groups. The organization observes that same environment through separate areas of responsibility, creating the possibility of a particular kind of blindness. The organization may not be blind to the individual pieces, but to the relationships among the pieces. That is why the question, which backup should we restore, became much more difficult as the workshop progressed. We did not lack backups, but certainty about which state of the organization could be trusted. That is blind, not an absence of sight, an incomplete field of sight. The word spot is especially useful because the entire organization is not blind. There are particular places within the organizational field of view where visibility is incomplete. There can be a spot between business requirements and technical decisions, detection and compromise, between backup and restoration, data availability and data integrity, between data and executive decision-making and technical disciplines. The vulnerability may not reside completely within any one of them. It can exist where their responsibilities and observations intersect or fail to intersect. And that gives us a deeper way of looking at the structural pattern risk blind spot. Now we have calibration. Now we have language for what we observed. The governance vulnerability appears when the risk moves across those boundaries more effectively than the organization's ability to see across them. That is where risk, blind, and spot come together. This brings us to the design phase in the executive navigation chart. Move from the structural pattern to its design resolution and consult the guidance developed throughout letters 13B through 23. We have named the structural pattern risk, blind, spot and examined what risk, blind, and spot revealed about the experience. Calibration moves us into now we understand what should be intentionally designed or strengthened. Appreciative inquiry changes the way we examine possible designs. If the risk blind spot exists partly because important observations are distributed across different areas of expertise, what would you intentionally design? Be careful about immediately deciding that the answer is to eliminate silos. Specialization is not the structural pattern we identified. Each specialist benefits from depth in understanding within their respective technology discipline. The question is what happens between them. None of those perspectives necessarily provided the entire picture. What capability would you intentionally design into the organization that would allow those different perspectives to become sufficiently connected to become capable of seeing what it cannot reliably see today? We are no longer asking how to make every specialist understand every technology. We are asking how to preserve specialized expertise while creating sufficient visibility across the boundaries of that expertise. Before the organization commits itself to a course of action, the executive can point the telescope in several directions by examining the same proposed design from different perspectives, introduced in letter 27A. Toward the perspective of purpose, what is this course of action intended to fulfill? Toward stewardship, what is it intended to serve? Toward strategy, what is it intended to advance? Toward design, what is it intended to enable? Toward capability, what is it intended to create? We are not looking for 5 different design resolutions. Maybe you create a cross-functional committee. Excellent. Explore it. What would that committee make possible that is difficult to accomplish today? What will become visible through that committee that is not sufficiently visible now? Would the committee connect the perspectives or simply bring the people possessing those perspectives into the same room? The same applies to a dashboard. What could a dashboard contribute? What would need to be represented on it for relationships among risks to become visible? Who determines which relationships matter? Or create another position? What capability would that position introduce? Would the capability reside in that person? Or would the position help institutionalize that capability throughout the organization? Would changing reporting relationships improve visibility across those boundaries? If so, which boundaries and why? Now we are not rejecting anything. The executive is learning how to evaluate a possible design resolution according to the capability it creates. We have intentionally designed or strengthened a capability intended to make relationships visible across boundaries that previously limited what the organization could see. The executive navigation chart now moves us into stewardship. Continue guiding the organization with the river, lighthouse, compass, and navigational chart as the organization continues evolving. This is especially relevant to risk blind spot because the environment that produced the blind spot does not remain still. That language is particularly important in this workshop because the environment we have been observing does not remain still. Threat actors change their methods. Business requirements change. What is at stake can change. A design that gives the organization sufficient visibility today does not mean that the same visibility will necessarily be sufficient as the organization continues evolving. Suppose we intentionally designed the capability to connect observations across networking, security, storage, applications, backup and recovery, and the business. What happens when a new technology is introduced? Where does it connect? Consider our earlier discussion about what is at stake. Suppose a system was originally designed to support a business activity that could tolerate several hours of interruption. The business evolves, and now several minutes of interruption creates significant consequences. The technology may still be functioning exactly as designed. The backups still work. Nothing necessarily failed. What is at stake changed. Would the organization recognize that change? Suppose data originally used for an operational report is later used for an executive dashboard, a regulatory submission, a customer service, or an artificial intelligence model. The data may be the same. What depends upon that data has changed. Has the organization's understanding of the risk changed with it? Stewardship becomes more than maintaining what we designed. We are continuing to observe whether the capability created through the design phase remains sufficient for the organization that exists now, rather than the organization that existed when the design was created. That brings us back to the three words we examined earlier. Risk can change because what is at stake changes. What the organization is blind to can change because technologies, responsibilities, dependencies, and relationships change. The spot can move because the intersections at which visibility becomes incomplete can move. Stewardship, therefore, does not assume that we permanently eliminated the risk blind spot. It asks whether the organization continues developing the capability to recognize where its field of view may have become incomplete. The final calibration of the executive navigation chart states, stewardship has reached another level of maturity. From this new altitude, relationships that were once hidden become visible, allowing the next stage of the journey to begin with greater clarity and intentionality. That is what we have experienced throughout this workshop. We began with technologies and specialists that could be viewed separately. We pointed the telescope toward what is at stake, and the meaning of the technical design changed. We heard we have backups, and then learned that the exploit kit may have been inside the environment while those backups were being created. We pointed the telescope toward the data, and the question changed from whether we could restore it to whether we could trust it. We directed our attention across the specialized areas of the organization and discovered that several accurate views do not necessarily provide visibility into the relationships among them. Then we intentionally considered what capability could be designed into the organization to make more of those relationships visible. Stewardship asks us to keep looking, The purpose is not to predict every future risk. It is to continue developing the organization's capability to recognize when changes in technology, information, responsibilities, dependencies, or business requirements have created relationships that deserve another look. The risk can cross boundaries that the organization's visibility does not. Our responsibility through stewardship is to continue examining whether those boundaries have changed, whether our visibility remains sufficient, and where the telescope needs to be pointed next. Thank you.